World War I Eastern Front. How the Russian army collapsed from within. The Eastern Front of World War I. A name that conjures images of vast, desolate plains, endless forests, and bitter cold. This was a theater of war unlike any other, stretching an astonishing 1,600 kilometers from the icy Baltic Sea in the north to the sun-baked Black Sea in the south. Compared to the static, trench-bound horror of the Western Front, the Eastern Front was a war of movement, of sweeping offensives and catastrophic retreats, often involving millions of men. For the Russian Empire, this wasn't just another conflict. It was an existential struggle that would not only decimate its immense army, but ultimately shatter its very foundations, leading to a profound internal collapse. This is the harrowing narrative of how the Russian army, a force of immense potential, succumbed not just to enemy bullets, but to internal decay, incompetent leadership, and the relentless erosion of morale, culminating in revolution and the dramatic downfall of a centuries-old dynasty. When the clarion call of war echoed across Europe in August 1914, Russia, a land of vast human resources, responded with a surge of nationalistic fervor. Millions of peasants, factory workers, and intellectuals were conscripted, forming the largest army in the world. Initial offensives, particularly the ill-fated invasion of East Prussia, began with an almost naive optimism, fueled by a desire to reclaim national pride after the humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War a decade earlier. However, this initial enthusiasm quickly dissipated, replaced by the grim reality of modern warfare. The devastating battles of Tannenberg and the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes became synonymous with Russian military catastrophe. In these brutal encounters, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, often due to poor coordination and outdated tactics. These early, crushing losses served as a stark, bloody revelation of the deep-seated structural issues plaguing the Russian military. A severe lack of modern weaponry, woefully inadequate logistical support, and a critical shortage of competent, professional officers. Soldiers were frequently sent to the front lines with insufficient rifles, sometimes sharing one firearm between 3 men, and many lacked even basic provisions like proper boots or warm clothing, a fatal oversight in the unforgiving Eastern European winters. The year 1915 dawned, bringing with it not hope, but an even greater torrent of disaster. The Central Powers, particularly the highly efficient German war machine, launched a series of relentless and devastating offensives, forcing the Russian army into what became known as the Great Retreat. Millions of square miles of Russian territory were lost. Entire regions scorched earth as the army withdrew. The sheer scale of this retreat was staggering, but even more horrifying was the human cost. Soldiers, already battered and demoralized by earlier defeats, faced not only the relentless pursuit of the enemy, but also the insidious threats of starvation, rampant disease, and the biting, unforgiving cold. The Russian supply lines, already fragile, completely disintegrated under the pressure. Trains meant to deliver food, ammunition, and desperately needed medical supplies often never reached the front. Hospitals were overwhelmed or non-existent, and wounded soldiers perished from neglect. Compounding the systemic failure was widespread corruption, a cancerous growth within the Tsarist administration, which diverted crucial resources and funds away from the desperate troops and into the pockets of unscrupulous officials. The chasm between the suffering at the front and the perceived indifference and incompetence of the civilian administration in Petrograd widened into an unbridgeable abyss. At the very heart of many of these escalating problems lay the deeply flawed leadership structure. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, initially appointed commander-in-chief, struggled valiantly but ultimately proved incapable of managing the immense and complex task of leading such a vast, ill-equipped army. However, the most significant and ultimately fatal leadership blunder came in September 1915. Against the fervent advice of his most experienced ministers and generals, Tsar Nicholas II, a man of deep religious conviction but profoundly limited military acumen, took personal command of the army. This decision, born of a desperate desire to inspire his troops and save his dynasty, proved catastrophic. It irrevocably tied the fate of the monarchy directly to the fortunes of the war. Every subsequent defeat, every lost battle, every retreating soldier, now became a direct, personal failure of the Tsar himself, eroding what little public confidence remained and utterly shattering the loyalty of the armed forces. His prolonged absence from the capital, Petrograd, also created a power vacuum, leaving the reins of government in the hands of his deeply unpopular German-born wife, Empress Alexandra, and her controversial, mystical confidant, Grigory Rasputin. This unholy trinity further fueled accusations of incompetence and treason, igniting widespread discontent across all strata of Russian society. The relentless succession of defeats, the unspeakable conditions at the front, and the growing perception of their leaders' utter incompetence utterly shattered the morale of the Russian soldiers. Letters smuggled home from the trenches painted a grim and heart-wrenching picture. Men starving, freezing, and dying in agony for a cause they no longer understood or believed in. The initial patriotic fervor had long since evaporated, replaced by a pervasive sense of futility and betrayal. Desertion rates, already a concern, skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. Soldiers, many of them unwilling peasants conscripted directly from their fields, simply walked away from the front lines, often discarding their weapons and heading back to their villages. They carried with them not only the physical scars of war, but also searing tales of suffering, injustice, and profound disillusionment, effectively spreading anti-war sentiment throughout the countryside. Fraternization with enemy soldiers, a silent but potent act of protest against the senseless slaughter, became increasingly common along certain sectors of the front, a stark indicator of the army's internal disintegration. Amidst this widespread despair and military collapse, the seeds of revolution found incredibly fertile ground. Bolshevik agitators, though initially a small and marginalized faction, skillfully exploited the war weariness and grievances of the troops and the burgeoning urban working class. Their message was simple, direct, and incredibly appealing. They promised peace, land, and bread. A stark, life-affirming contrast to the endless war, the landlessness that plagued the peasantry, and the gnawing hunger offered by the crumbling Tsarist regime. Anti-war propaganda, often distributed illicitly, circulated widely through the ranks, meticulously undermining what little loyalty to the Tsar and the war effort remained. The army, once considered the unwavering pillar of the monarchy, was slowly but inexorably transforming from a disciplined fighting force into a volatile hotbed of revolutionary sentiment, its loyalties shifting away from the Tsar and towards the promise of a new future. The war's devastating impact was far from confined to the brutal battlefields. Back home, the entire Russian economy buckled and groaned under the crushing strain of total war. Industrial production, almost entirely reoriented towards the insatiable demands of the war effort, severely neglected civilian needs. The result was catastrophic. Food shortages became endemic in the major cities, particularly Petrograd, leading to astronomical prices and widespread, debilitating hunger. The already inefficient transportation system, overwhelmed by the constant movement of troops and military supplies, completely failed to deliver essential foodstuffs to urban centers. Queues for bread stretched for blocks, often ending in disappointment and anger. Against this backdrop of economic hardship, strikes and protests became an almost daily occurrence, fueled by the palpable suffering of the populace and the growing, undeniable belief that the Tsarist government was either utterly incapable or entirely unwilling to alleviate their suffering. The social fabric of Russia was tearing at the seams. By the beginning of 1917, the situation had reached a critical, irreversible tipping point. The winter was exceptionally harsh, and the discontent simmered dangerously. On February 23rd, March 8th, New Style. A spontaneous demonstration erupted in Petrograd, led by women demanding bread. This spark quickly ignited a powder keg, escalating within days into massive, citywide protests, joined by tens of thousands of factory workers. Crucially, when ordered to suppress these increasingly violent demonstrations, the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, many of whom were raw recruits or veterans disillusioned by the war, mutinied. Instead of firing on the protesters, they sided with them, turning their weapons against the Tsarist authorities. This was the decisive, irreversible moment. Without the unwavering loyalty of its army, Tsar Nicholas II had no means whatsoever to maintain his autocratic power. On March 2, 1917, after immense pressure from his generals and politicians, he reluctantly abdicated, bringing an abrupt and ignominious end to over 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government, composed of liberal and moderate socialist figures, was hastily established, promising democratic reforms and, critically, a continuation of the war effort. The newly formed provisional government found itself immediately trapped in an impossible no-win dilemma. On one hand, it felt a deep moral and strategic obligation to its Western allies to continue fighting Germany, believing that a separate peace would be a betrayal. On the other hand, the vast majority of the Russian people, especially the war-weary soldiers, were utterly desperate for an immediate end to the brutal conflict. Attempts by the provisional government to reinvigorate the war effort and launch new offensives, such as the ill-fated Kerensky offensive in July 1917, met with catastrophic and predictable failure. Soldiers, now thoroughly politicized and heavily influenced by the revolutionary committees, Soviets, that had sprung up across the country, openly refused to obey orders. Discipline within the army collapsed entirely, giving way to rampant insubordination and mutiny. The once formidable Russian army was no longer a unified, coherent fighting force. It had disintegrated into a chaotic collection of disillusioned individuals, many of whom were far more interested in returning home to their villages to participate in the promised land reforms than in fighting for a cause they no longer supported. While the provisional government floundered, unable to resolve the twin crises of war and land, the Bolsheviks, under the cunning and ruthless leadership of Vladimir Lenin, rapidly gained momentum. Their simple, yet incredibly powerful slogans, peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets, resonated deeply with the war-weary populace and, crucially, with the mutinous soldiers. They expertly exploited the government's perceived weakness and its inability to deliver on its promises. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks had meticulously consolidated significant support within the Petrograd Soviet, the most powerful of the workers' and soldiers' councils, and among key military units stationed in the capital. On October 25, November 7, New Style, they launched a swift, armed insurrection, seizing key government buildings, communication centers, and strategic points in Petrograd with minimal resistance. The provisional government, utterly devoid of military support and popular legitimacy, quickly collapsed, marking the second and far more radical revolution of 1917. One of the very first and most urgent acts of the new Bolshevik government was to seek an immediate end to Russia's participation in the devastating war. Despite fierce internal debate within the Bolshevik Party over the harsh terms, they ultimately signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers in March 1918. This treaty was undeniably humiliating for Russia, forcing it to cede vast territories, including much of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, along with significant resources. However, it fulfilled the Bolsheviks' most crucial promise: peace. For the remnants of the Russian army, it marked the final, official, and long-awaited end to their agonizing participation in World War I. The army had not been defeated by an external enemy alone. It had disintegrated from within, a victim of its own systemic failures, chronic supply shortages, incompetent and often corrupt leadership, and the immense, unsustainable pressure of a modern, total war that an archaic empire simply could not bear. The collapse of the Russian army on the Eastern Front was far more than a mere military defeat. It was a profound societal implosion that irrevocably altered the course of 20th century history. It directly paved the way for the cataclysmic Russian Revolution, the brutal civil war that followed, and the eventual rise of the Soviet Union. The war acted as a powerful magnifying glass, exposing the deep-seated fissures and profound inequalities within Russian society, the inherent fragility and anachronism of the Tsarist autocracy, and the immense, revolutionary power of popular discontent when pushed to its absolute breaking point. The ordinary soldiers, predominantly peasants, who bore the unimaginable brunt of the suffering, ultimately became the unwitting agents of change, their disillusionment transforming into a potent, unstoppable revolutionary fervor. Their tragic story stands as a stark and enduring reminder of how internal weaknesses, exacerbated by overwhelming external pressures, can bring down even the most seemingly invincible empires. The echoes of the Eastern Front, a theater of unparalleled human suffering and systemic breakdown, reverberate through history, a powerful testament to the profound and devastating impact of total war on a nation utterly unprepared for its true, transformative cost.